Hello from the NAHRO convention in Florida, National NAHRO conference. I'm sitting down with DeDe HalfHill. I would try to tell our viewers your profile and your background, but I'd miss something, so I would.
You and me both.
I'm sitting there listening to your introduction, and I was like, I'm never keeping it right. I'm just going to ask her.
Oh, that's fine. That's
so
fine.
tell me a little bit about what's your background and where you come from. What's your story?
I think my basic story is I grew up in Dubuque, Iowa, and kind of realized like, wow, I want to see what's out there. So I joined the United States Air Force, and I spent 25 years in the Air Force. I had an unbelievable time, met amazing people, had incredible assignments, and just really had the privilege of getting to work every day toward something that matters and with people who were really passionate, quite like the NAHRO community.
So what's out there?
Great question, great question. What's out there is a lot of really committed people who really care. I think that's what's out there.
You talk about leadership.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we're hearing, especially in our industry, and not only in our industry, but it seems like on the landscape of a larger scale, is there seems to be a vacuum of leadership. Is that a fair assessment, or what's your take on that?
You know, I've seen amazing leaders. I've seen organizations that really have the kind of leadership we need, where they're stepping up and they're doing great things. And I've seen places that could use some help and need to find a way to encourage the leaders that are in the organization to really step up and step out. Leadership's hard. It's not easy. It is by far the hardest thing I've ever done. Now, I don't have kids, so I would guess that raising kids is probably harder, but very similar. Why? Because we care. We want great things for these people we love. Life throws you challenges and you have to navigate that. And so leading is really hard. I don't think we do enough to really prepare people for it. So I totally get why people might not think they are the right person to step up. That's not true. We need people to just step up because so much of great leadership is really just caring. And if you care, you can learn the other stuff. Everything I talked about today is a skill that is teachable, learnable, and you can practice.
I thought it was interesting in your talk, you mentioned something that jumped out at me about the exhaustion and how tired everybody is.
Yeah.
And we see this a lot in our industry. It's
Yeah.
just, we're just exhausted. It's one thing after another. But you framed it in a different context, and I want to talk a little bit about that when you said it's not necessarily exhaustion, it's loneliness,
Yeah.
and exhaustion is manifested through that. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Not 100% of the time. Like sometimes we're just tired. Like I get home and I'm like, man, I am tired. But what I thought was so interesting is that we as humans are very comfortable telling people we're tired. But when I read this article that was looking at organizations where their employee bases are reporting high levels of exhaustion, what they found after several months of talking to them was that they were actually lonely. And they didn't know how to communicate that loneliness. They knew how to communicate exhaustion. And so we have tons of people going around saying, I'm tired. But yet we now have plenty of data to show that loneliness is a national epidemic, in some cases an international epidemic. We are feeling so alone and so isolated, but don't always have the language to share that. It's safer to just say, I'm tired, because that feeling of loneliness manifests itself in that feeling of exhaustion. We don't even know how to label it ourselves correctly.
Do you think some of that is the fear of vulnerability? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily going to pour my life out to somebody.
Yeah. I mean, I think lonely carries, I think historically, this idea of I'm lonely carried a degree of shame around it. Why? Why don't you have community? Why don't you have friends? Why don't you have people like, we just thought I must be the only one who feels this way. But the day I was with my airmen and 3/4 of the room raised their hand to tell me they're not tired, they're lonely, we're not alone in that. I hate the saying as a leader, they say it's lonely at the top. And I'm like, we're just like reinforcing that. It doesn't have to be. we don't have to feel alone and feeling alone. We don't have to feel alone and feeling isolated. We don't have to feel alone in leadership if we can learn the skills of true connection. And I would not have thought this 10 years ago, but now doing the work I've done, studying the research I've studied, what I know is that connection is not just happenstance. We have to be deliberate in building it, and the skills are right in front of us if we want to take them.
That's fascinating. I mean, you know, it's interesting, especially coming from a military standpoint. I mean, you know, there's that, you don't talk about your feelings. And, you know, it was interesting in your document, you know, the different words in between the different documents of 48 to now and things. What has been some of the, I mean, you know, why do you think it kind of changed? I mean, I would think in the years, it would have been the other way.
I know. You and me both. Like, I thought, how can 1948, the men and the leaders, and I say men because, you know, in 1948 it was mostly men. Women weren't as represented in the military as they are today. And so I thought, how is it the men in 1948 were more comfortable with this emotional language to the degree that it's how they wrote about leadership, right? It wasn't just like, we're gonna write a manual on leadership and let's make sure we put some emotion in there. It was a part of their everyday language. I don't know why. I have some guesses. I can share those with you if you want. The reason I think it's really twofold. I think first and foremost, in 1948, the Air Force had just become its own service. We had just left the Army. And when you think about someone who is maneuvering a weapon system, you have to know how that weapon system operates inside and out, right?
Right.
The Air Force left the Army because it wanted to focus more on technology. It had this new thing, the airplane, that was changing warfare. It wanted to understand how air power, I mean, the airplane wasn't new, but really air power in war was still a relatively new advantage. And so it wanted to understand, how do we really focus on air power as a strategic advantage to combat? And so it was technological based. The Army was people. It was still people. And so if you have a weapon system, in the Armies it is the people, and in the Air Force it was the aircraft, you have to know how to maneuver it. And understanding people and their humanity and their emotional experience is part of understanding how to maneuver this weapon system. That's one. So I think, we just became more focused on technology. We continued to really focus on technology, and I think got away from the people part of it a little. I think the other thing is, and this I don't know for sure, but if you look at society today, we have statistically become a much more secular society. And at the time, 1948, probably more people, I know for sure more people in the military, were in some type of religious community, which means if you hear the language, right, kindness, forgiveness, mercy, it sounds like the kind of language we hear in these religious communities, right?
Right.
And I often joke around because one of my squadron commanders came up to me one day and he said, "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to stop saying the word fabulous." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I was out with my friends and they were like, 'Hey dude, how'd the TDY go?' And I was like, 'Fabulous.'" And he said, "I don't use the word fabulous." And I kind of laughed, but it reminded me how often when we're around people who are using certain words, a certain language, we pick it up, right?
Right.
And so if you think about it, in 1948, if we were involved to a greater degree of some type of religious community, it makes sense that that language would transfer over into our own language. The problem is, with emotion, if you can't speak it, you really can't do it.
Right.
It starts with language. So being comfortable with the language of emotion, using words like lonely and shame and kindness and love in the way we communicate is the first step to it also being the way we lead.
That's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I was interested to see the word love in a military manual.
I know.
That word came up and I thought, love in a military, it's not something that you would expect.
Right.
Let alone then.
Yeah, 13 times. So it wasn't just like a, hey, let's throw it in there. Like, they really meant it.
They really thought about it.
Yeah.
It seemed like they put a lot of thought into that manual.
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah, 1948.
And whether it's a criticism, you know, it's more of an observation, you know, they put a lot of thought into that document, whereas the newer manual, and you have more expertise, you can speak to this, but it seemed like it was like, okay, we'll write this, and it was more antiseptic, maybe is,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a fair assessment, but.
I will say they put just as much time into, I'm 100% confident. Like, you know, I wasn't there when they wrote AFM 35-15, but they put just as much time into it. But the difference is, over time, you could see how our language had changed. We were using a language, tactical, operational, strategic. It's how we talked. We were forgetting the humanity.
Well, DeDe, it's been a pleasure sitting down with you.
Oh, thank
you
you.
so much for coming and speaking at our conference.
Thank you. It's so wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.